There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in a $6 million house when you realize your husband is trying to kill you. In Savannah, the humidity doesn't just cling to the magnolias, it settles into the cracks of your soul, heavy with the scent of wet earth and the slow decay of things that were once beautiful. I sat my mahogany vanity, watching the morning light filter through the Spanish moss that draped over the windows like ghost hair. My fingers, steady despite the leaden fatigue in my limbs, smoothed a layer of la mer across my cheekbones. Even the world's most expensive cream couldn't hide the pallor or the strange, hazy grayness in my eyes. I glanced at my wrist where my Cartier tank watch ticked with a rhythmic, indifferent precision. It felt heavier than usual today, as if the gold was pulling me toward the floor. Alistair appeared in the doorway, his reflection catching the light before his voice did. At 58, he was the picture of refined southern masculinity, his silver-flecked hair perfectly coiffed, his Brooks Brothers suit tailored to hide the slight softness of a man who lived well on someone else's legacy. He walked toward me with that graceful, predatory gait I had once mistaken for elegance. He leaned down and I smelled it, the sharp antiseptic sting of peppermint masking something bitter, something wrong. His kiss on my neck felt like the cold glide of a copperhead in the tall grass. "You're looking a bit fragile this morning, Evelyn," he whispered, his hand resting on my shoulder. Through the silk of my robe, his palm felt searingly hot. "I've already told the driver to keep the Mercedes in the garage. You aren't fit for the gallery opening. I've brewed that special herbal blend the apothecary recommended. It's waiting for you downstairs in the Tiffany set." I forced my lips into a curve, a gesture that felt as brittle as the heirloom lace on my nightstand. "You're far too attentive, Alistair. Most men our age are out chasing shadows in shorter skirts, yet you spend your mornings playing nursemaid to a tired woman." He laughed, a rich baritone sound that used to make me feel safe. Now it just sounded like the tolling of a funeral bell. "I told you when we married 4 years ago, darling, I appreciate the classics. Contemporary things are loud and shallow. You have a soul that matches this house." He gestured vaguely to the high ceilings and the shadows that seemed to be growing longer even as the sun rose. He didn't see the way I watched him through the mirror. He only saw the Montgomery fortune, the trust funds, and the woman who stood between him and a penthouse on Park Avenue. The dizziness hit me then, a sickening swell that made the room tilt. I'd been feeling this way since our anniversary trip to the Ritz-Carlton, a slow, creeping fog that Alistair insisted was just the natural progression of time. He was so convincing. He made me feel like my own mind was a traitor. I watched him leave the room, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on the jewelry box that held my family's emeralds. I waited until the sound of his footsteps faded on the grand staircase before I stood up. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I wandered into his study, a room filled with the smell of old paper and the ghost of his expensive cigars. I reached for his Bible, the heavy leather-bound book he used to prove his God-fearing nature to the vestry at St. John's. I didn't know why I opened it. Maybe I was looking for a prayer. Instead, I found a death warrant. A small slip of yellow notepad paper fell onto the rug. I picked it up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The handwriting was a frantic feminine scrawl. "The 15th is too long. She's sturdier than we thought. Increase the drops in her morning tea. I want that Manhattan penthouse by spring. Love, S." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply read it again, the words searing themselves into my retinas. Then, I placed the note back exactly where it had been and closed the book. The soft thud of the leather cover sounded final, like a lid being hammered onto a coffin. I looked at my reflection in the dark wood of the desk and saw the woman I used to be, the one who built an empire before Alistair ever learned how to tie a silk tie. The fog in my brain didn't lift, but a cold, sharp light began to pierce through it. He thought he was watering a dying plant. He had no idea he was poking a lioness. The stairs of our Savannah estate felt steeper than they had yesterday, as if the wood itself were trying to discourage me from descending into the trap below. I took each step with a calculated slowness, my hand trailing along the polished mahogany banister, my Cartier watch feeling like a lead shackle on my wrist. I could hear the faint, cheerful whistling of a man who believed his problems were about to be solved by a funeral. Alistair was in the kitchen, the sunlight reflecting off the stainless steel of our high-end Sub-Zero appliances, making him look like a saint, bathed in celestial glow. He was pouring the tea into a delicate Tiffany & Co. porcelain cup, his movements as precise as a surgeon's. "There she is," he said, his voice dripping with a warmth that now made my skin crawl like a swarm of cicadas. "The lady of the house. I was just about to bring this up to you, Evelyn. You look like you've seen a ghost." "Perhaps I have, Alistair," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I sat at the breakfast nook, where my iPad Pro sat next to a stack of Architectural Digest magazines. The humidity always brings out the spirits in this old town. Or maybe it's just the lack of sleep. He set the tea in front of me. The steam rose in thin, ghostly ribbons, smelling of peppermint and a faint, bitter metallic tang that I now recognized as the scent of my own slow demise. "Drink, darling. It's a special blend. Silas found a new source for the valerian root. It will settle your nerves." I looked at the tea, then up at him. At 58, Alistair still had the jawline of a movie star and the eyes of a man who could convince a shark to buy a life jacket. It was almost funny, in a dark, southern sort of way. I had spent 40 years vetting artists and gallery owners, detecting forgeries with a single glance, yet I had invited the greatest counterfeit of all into my bed. I felt a sudden, sharp impulse to laugh, a dry, rattling sound that stayed trapped in my throat. "You know, Alistair," I said, picking up a silver Mont Blanc pen from the table and turning it over in my fingers. "I was thinking about our trip to the Ritz-Carlton. You were so attentive then. It's a wonder you haven't opened your own nursing home. You have such a clinical touch." He stiffened, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before resetting. "I just want you well, Evie. I want us to have those years in Manhattan we talked about, the penthouse overlooking the park, away from all this moss and rot." "The Manhattan penthouse," I echoed, the words tasting like ash. "Yes, it seems everyone is dreaming of New York these days." I reached for the cup, my fingers brushing against the cold porcelain. I lifted it to my lips, watching him over the rim. His eyes were dilated, his breathing shallow. He was waiting for the swallow. I let a drop touch my tongue, just enough to feel the tingle of the poison, before I let out a sharp, staged cough. "Oh goodness," I gasped, leaning forward and clumsily knocking my iPad off the table. As it clattered to the floor, I swept my arm across the tray, sending the Tiffany cup toppling. The dark, poisoned liquid soaked into the expensive linen runner and splashed onto the floor. "Evelyn, careful," Alistair hissed, his composure slipping as he lunged for the cup. "I'm so sorry, darling," I said, my voice trembling with a feigned frailty that made me want to gag. My hands, they just went numb. "I think I need to sit in the garden for a moment. The air in here is so thick." I stood up before he could protest, my legs feeling like they were made of glass. I walked past him, my silk robe whispering against the floorboards. I needed to get to the potting shed. I needed to see Silas. But as I passed the hall mirror, I saw Alistair staring at the spilled tea on the floor, his face twisted into a mask of pure, cold frustration. He wasn't worried about my health. He was annoyed that he'd have to brew another dose. I stepped out onto the veranda, the heat hitting me like a physical blow. The garden was a lush, overgrown prison of hydrangeas and weeping willows. I saw an Amazon box sitting on the porch bench, my new security cameras. Alistair thought they were for the intruders he claimed were prowling the neighborhood. He didn't realize that the only intruder was currently standing in our kitchen, wiping my blood money tea off the floor. I walked toward the back of the property, where the old stone walls were thick with ivy. I needed a plan, and I needed it before the sun went down. Because as I looked back at the house, I saw a shadow moving in the guest room window, a flash of blonde hair, a face I recognized from the church vestry. Sarah wasn't waiting for the 15th anymore. She was already inside. The heat in the garden was a physical weight, the kind that makes you wonder if the air itself is trying to bury you alive. I found Silas near the back of the estate, where the azaleas had grown wild and tangled, a chaotic contrast to the manicured lawn Alistair showed off to our neighbors. Silas was 80 if he was a day, his skin like old mahogany and eyes that had seen every scandal this city had to offer since the 1960s. He didn't look up as I approached, his gnarled hands continuing to prune the dying roses with a rusted pair of shears. "He's in the house with her, Silas," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of mulch and damp earth. "I know, Miss Evelyn," he replied, his voice a gravelly rasp that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. "I saw the girl slip through the service entrance while Mr. Alistair was at the church vestry yesterday. She didn't leave. She's been up in the attic rooms, quiet as a church mouse." A cold shiver raced through me, defying the Georgia sun. She was here, living in the guest wing like a parasite under the same roof where I slept. I pulled my iPhone 15 Pro Max from the pocket of my silk robe, the titanium frame feeling cold and clinical against my palm. I opened the app for the new Amazon security system I'd hidden behind the portraits of my ancestors. There, on the high-definition screen, was a grainy but unmistakable image of Sarah, wearing my favorite Hermes scarf no less, sipping from a Starbucks cup in the kitchen while Alistair wiped the floor. The sight of her in my silk, drinking her venti latte while waiting for me to die, sparked a fire in my gut that burned hotter than the fever. "I found this in the potting shed hidden under the old bags of fertilizer," Silas said, finally looking up. He handed me a small, dark glass bottle. It was unlabeled, but the residue around the rim was the same sickly, metallic green color of the tea Alistair served me every morning. He's been mixing it with the valerian root he buys from that organic shop in Manhattan. He thinks he's clever because it doesn't leave a scent. I took the bottle, my fingers brushing his weathered skin. "He thinks I'm a senile old woman, Silas. He thinks because I've spent my life surrounded by beauty that I don't know how to recognize filth when it's sitting at my dining table. Men like him always underestimate the women who built the houses they want to steal," Silas muttered. He gestured toward the carriage house where my father's old vintage car sat under a tarp. "I've moved your MacBook Air and the files from the safe into the trunk, and I've redirected the mail. He won't see the bank alerts." I looked back at the house, the grand white pillars gleaming in the sun. It looked like a temple, but inside it was a tomb. Alistair would be coming for me soon, another cup of medicine in his hands and a scripture on his lips. I felt a sudden sharp urge to laugh. He really was a terrible architect. He built his entire plan on the assumption that a woman over 60 is already half invisible. He hadn't accounted for the fact that in the South, we don't just bury our secrets, we tend to the gardens they're buried under. "Keep an eye on the side gate, Silas," I said, tucking the glass bottle into my pocket. "I'm going back in. I want to see the look on his face when I ask him where my Hermes scarf went. It's a little game we call Southern hospitality, and I have a feeling Alistair is about to lose his invitation." As I walked back, the dizziness flared again, but this time I leaned into it, using the frailty as a cloak. I passed a mirror in the hallway and saw the reflection of a victim. I smiled, a slow, dark thing that didn't reach my eyes. The victim was a ghost. The owner was just getting started. The heavy oak doors of the mansion groaned as I stepped back inside, a sound that felt like the house itself was sighing in warning. The interior was cool, the climate control keeping the Savannah heat at bay, but the air felt thick with a different kind of pressure. I walked through the foyer, my reflection ghosting across the polished surface of a George III sideboard that held a sprawling arrangement of white hydrangeas in a baccarat crystal vase. I stood there for a moment, adjusting the silk lapels of my robe, my Cartier rings catching the dim light. I could smell it again, that cloying, floral scent that didn't belong to me. It wasn't the sophisticated Dior J'adore I favored. It was something sweet and synthetic. The kind of perfume sold at mall kiosks to girls who dreamt of lives they hadn't earned. Alistair was in the dining room, adjusting the silver candlesticks on the long mahogany table. He had changed into a crisp linen shirt and a pair of loafers, looking every bit the retired gentleman. He looked up, his face instantly softening into that rehearsed mask of concern. "Evelyn, there you are. I was starting to worry. You were in the garden for a long time. The humidity is treacherous today." "I was just talking to the roses, Alistair," I said, moving toward the table. I noticed a small smudge of pink lipstick on the rim of a crystal glass, not my shade. I picked up the glass, turning it slowly in my hand, the lead crystal heavy and cold. They seem to be struggling. Something in the soil is toxic. He didn't blink. He just reached out and took the glass from my hand with a gentle, patronizing smile. I'll have Silas look into it. In the meantime, I've set the table for a quiet dinner. Just the two of us. I thought we could look over the brochures for that new development in Manhattan, the one near Central Park. It's exactly the kind of modern luxury you deserve. How thoughtful, I murmured, sliding into my chair. The seat felt like a throne in a crumbling kingdom. I pulled my iPhone 15 Pro Max from my pocket and set it on the table. A notification flickered, a motion alert from the attic camera. I didn't look at it. I knew what it showed. Sarah was likely sitting on my vintage Louis Vuitton trunks, checking her reflection in a mirror that had been in my family for 4 generations. The irony was almost delicious. He was trying to sell me a future in New York, while his past was hiding in my rafters. I've ordered a bottle of Opus 1 from the cellar, Alistair said, his voice light and airy. To celebrate, to new beginnings. New beginnings, I echoed, my voice as dry as the old parchment in his study. I watched him pour the wine, the dark red liquid swirling in the glass like a pooling bruise. He was so careful, so attentive. He even adjusted the Dior napkins, ensuring the monogram was perfectly centered. It was a beautiful performance. If I hadn't found that note, I might have actually believed he loved me. I might have died with a smile on my face, grateful for the man who was ushering me into the dark. You know, Alistair, I said, taking a tiny performative sip of the wine. I was thinking about Sarah today, the girl from the vestry. She had such a lovely scarf the last time I saw her. It looked remarkably like the Hermes one I lost last month. Do you remember seeing it? The silence that followed was so sharp it could have drawn blood. Alistair's hand froze for a fraction of a second over the silver salt cellar. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for a hint of suspicion. But I gave him nothing but the vacant, tired gaze of a woman losing her grip. He let out a soft, forced chuckle. Sarah, I'm sure she has her own things, Evie. You're just a bit confused. The medicine makes your mind play tricks. Why don't you finish your wine? It'll help you sleep. I smiled at him, a slow, terrifyingly calm smile that I'd perfected over decades of boardroom battles. You're right, darling. My mind is playing the most extraordinary tricks. It's almost as if I can hear breathing coming from the guest wing. Isn't that funny? This house has always been full of ghosts, but I never expected them to be so loud. I stood up, my legs steadier than they had been in weeks. The adrenaline was flushing the poison from my system, replacing the fog with a cold, crystalline clarity. I think I'll skip dinner tonight. I have a sudden urge to check the attic. I'm sure I left my old Tiffany jewelry box up there, and I'd hate for it to get misplaced. Alistair's face drained of color, his refined mask finally cracking to reveal the panicked predator beneath. I turned my back on him, my silk robe billowing like a shroud as I walked toward the grand staircase. I didn't need to look back to know he was following me. I could hear the heavy thud of his loafers on the hardwood, the sound of a man who realized the bird had not only escaped the cage, but had suddenly grown claws. The air grew thin as I ascended, the temperature rising with every step away from the climate-controlled sanctuary of the lower floors. The third-floor hallway was a gallery of ghosts, lined with sepia-toned portraits of Montgomery ancestors who seemed to watch my slow climb with disapproving eyes. My Cartier tank watch felt like a ticking heart against my wrist, a reminder that time was a luxury I could no longer afford to waste. I could hear Alistair's breathing behind me, heavy, jagged, and devoid of the rhythmic grace he usually practiced. He was a man watching his carefully constructed stage set collapse, and the desperation coming off him was more pungent than the scent of old wood and mothballs. Evelyn, stop, he pleaded, his voice cracking. You're not well, you're having a breakdown. Let's go back down, have some tea, and call the doctor from the Mayo Clinic. You know how much you trust his opinion. I'm done with doctors, Alistair, I said, my hand resting on the brass knob of the guest suite door. And I'm certainly done with your tea. I pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the amber glow of the setting Savannah sun, filtering through the dust motes like liquid gold. And there she was. Sarah was sitting on the edge of a vintage Louis Vuitton steamer trunk, her blonde hair illuminated by the light. She was younger than I'd imagined from the grainy security footage, barely 30, with the kind of soft, unformed features that suggested she'd never had to make a difficult decision in her life. She was wearing my vintage Chanel jacket and that damn Hermès scarf, looking like a child playing dress-up in her mother's closet. The humor of the situation hit me then, a sharp, dry irony that only a woman of my age can truly appreciate. Here was the S from the note, the grand architect of my demise, and she looked like she'd be more at home at a suburban mall than in a Gothic mansion. "I believe that jacket is a size 6, dear," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a silver letter opener. "You're stretching the seams. And the scarf? It really doesn't go with that cheap perfume." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her throat, her eyes darting to Alistair, who stood frozen in the doorway. "Julian? I mean Alistair. You said she was sedated. You said it was almost over." "Julian?" I echoed, a cold laugh escaping my lips. "Oh, Alistair? Or is it Julian today? You really should keep your aliases organized. It's so gauche to lose track of who you are." I walked further into the room, my silk robe billowing behind me. I felt a strange, detached sense of power. I reached for a small, velvet-lined box on the dresser, a piece of Tiffany & Co. heritage that had belonged to my grandmother. I opened it, the emeralds inside gleaming with a malevolent green fire. "You wanted these, didn't you? The Montgomery emeralds. A down payment on a life you'll never have." "Evelyn, listen to me," Alistair said, stepping into the room, his face twisted into a snarl that finally matched his soul. "You're an old woman. You're lonely, you're sick, and you're irrelevant. Nobody will believe a word you say. They'll think you've lost your mind to the same dementia that took your father." "Is that what you told Sarah?" I asked, turning to face him. I held up my iPhone 15 Pro Max, the screen glowing with a live feed of the local police station. "Because I've been recording this entire conversation via the Amazon cloud. Silas has already delivered the glass bottle from the potting shed to the authorities. The special blend is currently being analyzed for arsenic." Alistair's face went white. He lunged toward me, his hands outstretched like claws, but he tripped over the very Louis Vuitton trunk Sarah was sitting on. He sprawled onto the floor, his Brooks Brothers shirt catching on a brass latch. It was a pathetic, clumsy display, a far cry from the sophisticated gentleman he pretended to be. "I might be 62, Alistair," I said, looking down at him with a pity that burned hotter than rage. "But I built an international art empire while you were still trying to figure out which fork to use at a dinner party. You didn't marry a victim, you married an auditor, and your accounts are officially overdrawn." I turned to Sarah, who was trembling so hard the pearls on her neck, my pearls, were clicking together. "Take off my clothes, Sarah. Now. Before I decide to let the police find you in them." The silence that followed was louder than the thunder currently bruising the Savannah skyline. Outside, the sky had turned a sickly shade of violet, the kind of atmosphere that makes the weeping willows look like mourning widows. Inside the guest suite, the air smelled of stale Chanel No. 5 and the metallic tang of fear. Alistair scrambled to his feet, his Brooks Brothers shirt snagged and ruined, his face no longer that of a refined gentleman, but of a cornered rat. He looked at the iPhone in my hand as if it were a detonator. "You think you've won, Evelyn?" he spat, his voice losing its velvet sheen, replaced by a jagged, desperate edge. "You're a 62-year-old woman with a failing heart and a mind clouded by the very medicine I've been giving you. By the time the police get through that gate, I'll have convinced them you've had a psychotic break. Who are they going to believe? A pillar of the St. John's vestry, or a woman who's been seen talking to her roses for months?" "I wasn't talking to the roses, Alistair," I said, my voice eerily calm as I stepped back toward the George III writing desk. "I was talking to the microphones Silas installed in the planters. Every time you whispered to Sarah about the Manhattan penthouse while we were pruning the hydrangeas, the cloud was listening." Sarah let out a pathetic whimpering sound. She was fumbling with the buttons of my vintage Chanel jacket, her movements clumsy and frantic. In her haste, she knocked over a half-finished Starbucks latte, the beige liquid soaking into the cream-colored Persian rug. I looked at the stain and felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief. Not for the rug, and certainly not for the man, but for the version of my life I had so desperately wanted to be true. I thought of our nights at the Ritz-Carlton, the way he'd hold my hand and talk about growing old together. It was the ultimate forgery, and I, the great appraiser, had been the easiest mark of all. A single hot tear escaped and rolled down my cheek, a silent witness to my own foolishness. "Don't cry for me, Evie," Alistair sneered, misinterpreting my grief for weakness. He took a step toward me, his eyes darting to the heavy baccarat crystal carafe on the nightstand. "It's too late for tears. You should have just stayed in bed and finished your tea. It would have been so much more dignified." "I'm not crying for you, Alistair," I said, wiping the moisture away with the back of my hand, my Cartier rings catching the flickering light as the storm finally broke outside. "I'm crying for the woman I was 4 years ago, the one who thought she needed a man like you to feel alive. It's a hilarious joke, really. I spent $40,000 on that Hawaiian honeymoon just to buy my own funeral." I let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across marble. Alistair lunged then, his refined mask completely shattered. He didn't move with the grace of an architect. He moved with the clumsy violence of a man who had run out of lies. He reached for the phone, his fingers grazing my wrist, but the floor beneath us, the old original heart pine wood, seemed to groan in protest. Suddenly, the house's Bose surround system, which I'd linked to the security app, roared to life. It wasn't music. It was Alistair's own voice, amplified and distorted, echoing through the high ceilings of the mansion. "Increase the drops. She's sturdier than we thought." The sound was deafening, a ghostly confession vibrating through the very walls he hoped to inherit. Alistair froze, his face draining of what little color was left. Sarah began to scream, a high-pitched, mindless sound, as she threw off the Chanel jacket and huddled in the corner like a shamed child. I stood my ground, the lightning illuminating the room in jagged strobes of white. In that moment, I didn't feel 62. I felt ancient and indestructible, like the oak trees that had survived a century of hurricanes. I looked him dead in the eye and saw the truth. He wasn't a monster. He was just a small, greedy man who had vastly underestimated the house he was trying to haunt. His voice, boomed through the Bose speakers like a judgment from a god who had finally run out of patience. It filled every corner of the guest suite, vibrating the baccarat crystal on the vanity and shaking the very foundation of the life Alistair had tried to steal. He looked at me, and for a second, the 58-year-old refined gentleman was gone, replaced by something ancient and hollow. He looked at the iPad Pro on the nightstand, the digital witness to his ruin, and a low, guttural growl escaped his throat. I tried to back away, my heels clicking on the hardwood, but my legs felt like they were made of water. The arsenic, or whatever special blend he'd been feeding me, was finally claiming its toll. My vision blurred, the edges of the room turning into the same hazy gray as the Spanish moss outside. Alistair didn't lung for me this time. He lunged for the iPad. He grabbed it and slammed it against the corner of the heavy Louis Vuitton trunk, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of dead pixels. "You think a few recordings change anything, Evelyn?" He screamed over the sound of the storm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold St. DuPont lighter, the one I'd bought him for his birthday at a boutique on Fifth Avenue. He flicked it open, the flame dancing in his eyes. "If this house goes up, the server goes with it. The wiring in these old Savannah mansions is notoriously unstable. The fire marshal will call it a tragic accident. A grieving widower and his poor, confused wife lost to a faulty circuit." Sarah let out a strangled cry, scrambling away from him. "Alistair, no, you didn't say anything about a fire. I'm not dying for this." "Shut up, Sarah," he roared, turning toward the heavy velvet curtains I'd imported from Italy. He held the flame to the fabric. For a moment, the fire hesitated, as if the house itself were resisting him, and then it took. A thin line of orange began to climb the drapes. I felt a strange, detached sense of irony. Here I was, surrounded by the finest things money could buy, the Cartier watch on my wrist, the Dior silk under my touch, and I was about to be turned into ash because a man couldn't handle the word no. I reached for the heavy silver Mont Blanc pen on the desk, the only weapon I had. My heart was thumping a jagged, uneven rhythm, a protest against the poison in my veins. "You're a terrible architect, Alistair," I wheezed, the smoke starting to sting my throat. "You forgot one thing. Silas isn't just a gardener. He's the one who installed the industrial-grade sprinkler system when we renovated the gallery wing last year. He has the remote." Alistair froze, the lighter still in his hand. The fire was spreading, the heat beginning to bake the air in the small room. He looked at me, then at the ceiling, waiting for the water that hadn't come yet. He laughed, a high, thin sound that bordered on insanity. "You're bluffing. You're always playing the grand matriarch, Evie, but you're just a lonely woman in a big, empty house." He stepped toward me, the smoke curling around his silver hair like a halo of soot. He reached out to grab my throat, his fingers cold and smelling of expensive tobacco. I raised the Mont Blanc pen, not to strike him, but to point at the window behind him. The blue and red lights of the Savannah PD were already reflecting off the rain-slicked oaks in the driveway. The silent alarm I'd triggered on my iPhone 20 minutes ago had worked. Silas hadn't just moved the car, he'd opened the gates. Alistair turned, his face illuminated by the police sirens and the growing fire. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The silver fox had finally run out of forest to hide in. I slumped against the wall, the world tilting as the first blast of the sprinklers finally drenched the room, turning the fire into a choking cloud of steam. Through the haze, I saw the bedroom door burst open, but it wasn't the police who reached me first. It was the crushing weight of the ceiling, or perhaps just the darkness I had been fighting all morning. The freezing water from the industrial sprinklers was a baptism I hadn't asked for, drenching my silk robe and turning the smoke into a thick, suffocating veil of gray. I slumped against the mahogany bedpost, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Through the haze, I saw Alistair, or whatever his name truly was, stumbling toward the door, his ruined Brooks Brothers jacket clinging to his frame like a wet shroud. He looked less like a refined architect and more like a drowned rat scurrying for a hole. He didn't even glance at Sarah, who was curled on the floor, weeping into the soaked Persian rug while clutching a Dior handbag she had clearly emptied my safe into. "It's over, Alistair," I coughed, the metallic taste of the poison still clinging to the back of my throat. "The house always wins." He turned, his face a mask of primal fury. But before he could speak, the door didn't just open. It was nearly taken off its hinges. 2 officers in tactical gear swarmed in, but it was the man behind them who made my heart skip a beat. He was tall, mid-60s, wearing a charcoal gray suit that screamed bespoke Savile Row and a Patek Philippe that glinted even in the dim, watery light. It was Harrison Reed, the senior partner of the most prestigious law firm in Manhattan, and a man I hadn't seen since I'd turned down his marriage proposal 30 years ago. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the chaos. He stepped over the debris, ignoring the water ruining his polished Oxford shoes. He looked at Alistair with the kind of clinical disgust one reserves for a smudge on a window. "Harrison?" I whispered, feeling the last of my strength ebb away. "What are you doing in Savannah?" "I've been tracking this man for 3 years, Evie," Harrison said, kneeling beside me and wrapping his dry cashmere overcoat around my shivering shoulders. "Only his name isn't Alistair, and he's not 58. Meet Clarence Higgins, a 52-year-old high-stakes grifter with a penchant for plastic surgery and a trail of accidental widows from Palm Beach to the Hamptons." I looked at the man I had shared my bed with. Alistair, Clarence, was pinned against the wall by the officers. The silver fox looked pathetic, his carefully dyed hair leaking dark streaks down his forehead. I felt a sudden, sharp urge to laugh through the pain. "You lied about your age, Clarence? That's the most honest thing you've done since we met." The shock came when Harrison pulled a file from his leather briefcase. "He didn't just want your money, Evelyn. He's the nephew of Arthur's old business rival. He blamed your first husband for his family's bankruptcy. This wasn't just a con, it was a decades-long grudge. He wanted to dismantle the Montgomery legacy piece by piece." The room spun. My entire second act, the romance I thought had saved me from loneliness, was a meticulously curated vendetta. I looked at the shattered remains of my iPad and the charred Tiffany curtains. The pain was a physical weight, heavier than the water-soaked silk. I had been so desperate to be loved that I had invited my own executioner to pour my tea. A single, jagged sob escaped my throat, lost in the sound of the receding storm. "I've got the Mercedes waiting downstairs, Evelyn," Harrison whispered, his hand steady on mine. "The paramedics are at the gate. You're going to be fine. I've already contacted the specialists at the Mayo Clinic to flush that filth out of your system." As they led Clarence away in handcuffs, he looked back at me, his eyes cold and hollow. "You're still just an old woman in a big house, Evelyn. No amount of money changes that." I sat up, leaning on Harrison's arm, and looked at the man who had tried to erase me. "I might be an old woman, Clarence," I said, my voice regaining its iron edge. "But I'm an old woman who still owns the house, the land, and the man who's going to ensure you spend the rest of your life in a state-issued jumpsuit. And for the record, the Brooks Brothers suit was a knockoff. I knew the moment I bought it." The Savannah courthouse felt like a grand, hollow monument to the sins of the South. I sat in the witness box, the cold marble beneath my palms, a sharp contrast to the heat of the humid afternoon outside. I was wearing a black silk Dior suit that felt more like armor than clothing, and my Cartier sunglasses rested on the mahogany rail in front of me. I had spent my life surrounded by beautiful things, but in this room, the only thing on display was the ugly, jagged truth. I looked across the room at the man I had called my husband. Clarence Higgins, no longer the Alistair of my dreams, sat at the defense table, his 52-year-old face haggard and gray without the soft lighting of our mansion. He looked like a masterpiece that had been left in the rain until the paint began to run. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman who looked like she'd been carved out of Georgia granite, began to play the audio files Silas had retrieved from the cloud. The voice that filled the courtroom was rich, baritone, and utterly chilling. "She's sturdier than we thought. Increase the drops." As the recording played, I felt a familiar cold numbness creeping into my chest. It wasn't the arsenic this time. It was the sheer weight of the humiliation. I looked at the gallery, filled with the same people who had toasted our anniversary at the Ritz-Carlton. I could feel their eyes on me, pity, curiosity, and that southern brand of judgment that is always served with a polite smile. Sarah was the first to break. She sat on the stand, clutching a damp tissue and wearing a cheap, off-the-rack dress that was a far cry from the Chanel jacket she'd tried to steal from my closet. Her testimony was a rambling, tearful confession of greed and insecurity. She talked about the Starbucks meetings where they'd planned my accidental stroke, the way they'd laughed at my loneliness while they spent my money on a Manhattan penthouse deposit. Hearing it laid bare in the sterile light of a courtroom was a different kind of poison. I realized then that Clarence hadn't just been trying to kill me. He'd been trying to erase me. He'd treated my life like a ledger he could simply close whenever it suited him. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't look at the judge. I looked directly at Clarence. I thought about the nights we'd spent talking about our legacy, the way he'd kiss my hand while I sipped that bitter tea. I felt a sudden, sharp urge to laugh, not because it was funny, but because the irony was so perfect. I had been so busy appraising the world that I had forgotten to appraise the man in my own bed. "I have spent 40 years detecting forgeries," I said, my voice steady, carrying the ironclad authority of a woman who had built an empire from nothing. "And I can tell the court that Clarence Higgins is the most pathetic counterfeit I have ever encountered. He didn't just want my money, he wanted the soul of this family because he didn't have one of his own." The verdict didn't take long. When the judge read the sentence, 20 years for attempted murder, grand larceny, and fraud, there was no dramatic outcry, only the sound of the bailiff's heavy boots and the metallic click of handcuffs being tightened over Clarence's wrists. His Rolex was stripped from him and placed in an evidence bag, a small gold tombstone for a life built on lies. As they led him away, he looked back at me, his eyes full of a desperate, primal rage. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt clean. The humidity of Savannah finally felt like it was lifting. The sale of the Savannah estate felt less like a business transaction and more like an exorcism. I watched the movers carry the last of the heavy, mahogany ghosts into an Amazon delivery truck, headed for an auction house in Atlanta. I didn't want the silver, the baccarat vases, or the portraits of men who had spent centuries pretending that a white pillar could hide a black heart. I kept only my MacBook Pro, a single suitcase of Dior silks, and the Cartier watch that had timed my escape. As I stood on the sidewalk of Jones Street for the last time, the air was still thick enough to chew, but the weight on my chest had finally vanished. I left the keys with Silas, along with a check large enough for him to retire to that beach house in Tybee Island he'd always talked about. "Don't look back, Miss Evelyn," he said, his eyes crinkling with a rare, honest smile. "The moss has a way of catching those who hesitate." Manhattan in December was the perfect antidote to the rot of the South. The air was a sharp, crystalline blade that cut through the lingering fog in my mind, making me feel more alive at 62 than I had at 20. My new penthouse on Fifth Avenue overlooked the snowy expanse of Central Park, a view that didn't hide any secrets behind weeping willows. I spent my mornings at a small, sun-drenched cafe near the Guggenheim, sipping an oat milk latte that definitely didn't taste like arsenic. I had opened a new gallery in Chelsea, focusing on female artists over 50. Women who, like me, had been told they were invisible and decided to become incandescent instead. Harrison Reed became a permanent fixture in this new chapter. He didn't approach me with the rehearsed grace of a predator. He was a man of comfortable silences and sharp intellect. We were sitting at the River Café, the Manhattan skyline glittering like a Tiffany diamond across the water, when he handed me a small, wrapped box. "A housewarming gift," he said, his Patek Philippe glinting under the soft candlelight. I opened it to find a vintage, first-edition copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. I laughed, a genuine hearty sound that made a nearby table of socialites turn in surprise. "No hidden notes inside, I hope?" I teased. He smiled, his eyes warm and devoid of the hollow hunger I'd grown used to. "Only a bookmark, Evelyn. And it's a one-way ticket to the Metropolitan Opera for tonight." I thought about Clarence sometimes, usually when I was reading the news about the seizure of his various shell companies. His 20-year sentence was being served in a facility that certainly didn't offer Brooks Brothers linens or Ritz-Carlton room service. I heard through the legal grapevine that Sarah had been released on parole but was working as a waitress at a bus stop diner in rural Alabama, her dreams of a Manhattan penthouse reduced to tips on a plastic tray. I didn't feel the need for a final confrontation. The best revenge wasn't a shouting match. It was the fact that I was currently eating $100 truffle risotto while he was eating lukewarm mystery meat. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the restaurant window. The woman staring back was radiant. The gray haze in her eyes was gone, replaced by a clarity that only comes from staring into the abyss and deciding to build a bridge over it. I reached into my Hermes bag, a new one, bought with my own hard-earned commission, and pulled out my iPhone to check the sales from the gallery. We had sold out the entire debut show. I wasn't a widow, a victim, or a classic to be curated by a con man. I was Evelyn Montgomery, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I took a sip of my wine, a crisp, honest Sancerre, and toasted to the silence. Not the silence of a trap, but the beautiful, soaring silence of a woman who had finally found her own voice. The first snow of the season settled over Central Park like a soft white veil, a silent contrast to the heavy, weeping moss of my past. I sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, wrapped in a Loro Piana cashmere throw that felt like a warm, genuine embrace. On the marble coffee table, there was no bitter tea or hidden notes, only a steaming cup of Starbucks Reserve coffee and my Kindle Oasis, open to a passage in Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I read the words slowly, savoring the clarity that comes when you finally stop trying to curate your own tragedy. My hands, no longer trembling from poison or fear, were steady as I turned the page. Harrison joined me a moment later, bringing with him the scent of crisp winter air and the quiet comfort of a man who had nothing to prove. He didn't offer a rehearsed compliment or a predatory smile. He simply sat on the edge of the sofa and placed a hand near mine, a silent offer of companionship. "The city looks peaceful today, doesn't it?" he remarked, his voice a calm anchor in the morning light. I looked at him and realized that the greatest luxury of my new life wasn't the Fifth Avenue address or the gallery success. It was the absence of the performance. I didn't have to be a masterpiece for Harrison. I just had to be Evelyn. To anyone standing in the shadows of a beautiful house, wondering if the walls are closing in, know that it is never too late to walk out the door. The humidity of the past can be suffocating, and the tea may be sweet, but the cold, honest air of freedom is worth every bit of the struggle. I leaned my head back, watching the snowflakes dance over the Manhattan skyline, and for the first time in 62 years, I didn't just feel alive. I felt safe.